So I'd like to welcome you all to the King's Road in Chelsea. And the reason we're here today is we are going to talk about Mark Twain, the London world of Mark Twain. And he did live in this area for about a year and a half near the end of his life. He was born in Florida, Missouri, to Jane and John Marshall Clemens, November 30th, 1835. He said years later his birthplace was a nearly invisible village and a small population of 100. And he said when he was born, he increased the population by 1%, and it was more than many of the best men in history could have done for a small town. If you go there today, there's a Mark Twain lake, a visitors centre, and it has first editions, furniture from the original house he was born, and a monument. But we're here around Sloane Square in SW3 in London, southwest London, to talk about his life and to gradually end up where he lived for a little while. Now, Mark's father, John, was an attorney, a judge, quite a proud, hard-working man. His mother, Jane, gave birth to and raised 7 children, and Mark was the 6th. And from what I've read about Jane, she seemed to have a dry wit. She's very sociable, life and soul type, and it seems like she was the life and soul of the party. Massive influence on Mark, whereas his father was a bit more distant and quiet. Mark Twain was born 2 weeks after the closest approach to Earth of a very famous comet named Halley's Comet. Halley's Comet is periodic, and it appears close to the Earth every 75 years or so, named after the astronomer Edmund Halley in the early 1700s. In 1839, at this point, Twain is 5 years old. He's still known as Samuel Langhorne Clemens, but we'll use the name Mark Twain and we'll explain why he changed his name in a while, his pen name anyway. Hannibal, Missouri is a port town, and that's where they moved to, on the Mississippi River. It would have been the inspiration for the stories like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He idolized riverboat pilots, steamboat pilots. As well as these riverbank inspirations, Missouri was also a slave state. And Mark Twain became familiar with the ins and outs and troubles of slavery, and it helped him in his writing. He made visits back to the birth town of Florida, Missouri, to extended family, way until later years. He used them as most writers did in his stories. He said in his memoirs years later that his mother, Jane, was actually Aunt Polly in Tom Sawyer. Jane always had visitors over, and everyone seemed to just call her Aunt Jane. But tragedy struck the family quite soon on. In 1847, he's only 11 years old, a mischievous child, an inquisitive child, and his father passes away from pneumonia. And to help the family at such a young age, he becomes a printer's apprentice, a typesetter, and he soon was writing articles and sketches for a newspaper owned by his older brother, and it was called the Hannibal Journal. And he's a teenager. 1853, he has his first experience with printing. He travelled and worked in many places, New York City, St. Louis, Philadelphia. He joined the Printers Union, and he's starting to write articles and sketches for different local papers around the country, but travelling as a typesetter. He's not having what we would call a regular education. In the evenings, because he is travelling, every town he goes to libraries to study. He had left school in 5th grade to help the family by earning money, like George Orwell, like Agatha Christie, and in a way he's homeschooling himself. So although this do-it-yourself approach wouldn't work for everyone, hardly anyone, he himself is getting a wider education on his own in the evenings than he would at a conventional school. He's also working as a correspondent, and he's gaining a lot of experience in the newspaper business. In this area, we have a Sloane Street, a Sloane Square, a Sloane School, all named after that man there, Hans Sloane. There's also a Hans Street, a Hans Crescent. 1856, Mark Twain gives his first speech. He seems to have this great turn of phrase. At a very early age, a great way of speaking earned him money and praise. And he became booked as a lecturer. He was saying yes to everything. He's writing his own articles and then reading them out and talking about his life experience. You could almost say he was the world's first observational stand-up comedian. And he recalls his first speech years later. He's in his late teens. He's in San Francisco, about to read from this article he had published. And he mentioned that the two worst maladies in the world were seasickness and stage fright. He got seasickness once and somehow conditioned his body never to get it again. And in San Francisco, in his late teens, he got stage fright once in his first public reading, and never again. But he has this dream, this ambition, that's longing. He wants to be a steamboat or riverboat pilot. In the memoir Life on the Mississippi, that was published in 1883, he says he's only got one love. He's only got one course that he wants to take in his life. He wants to become a steamboat pilot. He said it was the grandest job of them all. He said the pilot of the boat, the prestige that holds, far exceeds that of the captain. The captain gets to know the passengers and the voyagers, but the pilot gets to know the river. And after 2 years of studying the Mississippi River, he earns his river pilot license. He creates a pen name, Mark Twain, something the riverboat workers used to shout. It was a warning. When the water was at its shallowest, Mark Twain, it was the measurement of the river depth of 2 fathoms. A fathom is about 6 feet, or the length of rope between 2 outstretched hands. It was also suggested that maybe he shouted the phrase when he went into bars. Bars that knew him, he would often order 2 shots of whiskey, and if he didn't have the money on him at the time, he would just shout, "Mark Twain!" So the barman would chalk 2 lines on a chalkboard, and he'd remember to pay the next time. He should have been able to afford it. He's earning, at that point, in the 1850s, $250 a month. And he works as a riverboat pilot for a few years until the Civil War breaks out in 1861, and he heads out west to Nevada, to Virginia City, a silver mining town in the hills near Carson City. He's trying to make a fortune. He admits many years later that he was not a good miner, and he becomes a newspaper man again, a writer. The mining experiences, though, and of course being a riverboat pilot, they become influences and material for his many stories. 1864, Twain moves to San Francisco, California. He's starting to meet other famous writers of the time. And he gets his first short story published. 1865, The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County. And many more follow in quick succession. He is making a name for himself very highly and very quickly as both a writer and a performer. The great American novelist W.D. Howells said that a good actor doubles the effect of an author's words, and he said that Mark Twain was both. 1867, he meets his soon-to-be wife. He's on board a ship to the Holy Land. He meets his future brother-in-law, who shows Twain a picture of his sister, Olivia, and he falls in love with a picture of her at first sight. He eventually meets her. They strike up a friendship, and their first proper date night, and I love this, is in 1868 at a reading given in New York by one Charles Dickens. And although Olivia Langdon, or Livy as she was known, rejects his first proposal of marriage, they seem to sort things out. And in 1870 they marry in New York. She was from a wealthy and, more importantly, a well-connected family. And she introduces Mark to many famous people of the time. They have 3 children, daughters who survive, and one male child who dies when he's 2 years old. In 1874, the family moved to Hartford, Connecticut. They build a home there. It could really be today that the home might no longer be there. It was falling into disrepair in the 1900s, and it was about to be torn down, and in 1927 it was saved and is now the Mark Twain Museum. The family lived there for 17 years. It's believed he wrote many of his classic novels there, or at Livy's family's house in Elmira, New York. Those stories include The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, The Prince and the Pauper, Life on the Mississippi, his memoir, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and my personal favourite, A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. Let's go back to one of those stories. Briefly talk about Huckleberry Finn, published in 1885, and it probably changed the face of literature worldwide. It certainly did in America. It wasn't released until 9 years after its prequel, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, and certain characters overlap. It's more or less set all along the Mississippi River, and it's really a simple road tale. And their adventures, 2 people who have run away, trying to get somewhere safe. A boy, Huckleberry, who's trying to be moulded into something he's not by family. So quite darkly, he fakes his own murder and goes on the run. And with him goes Jim, a slave who realizes he's about to be sold to another family, and he runs away from a plantation. And it involves their adventures to get to a free state where they can live happily. It's a moral tale. It is vehemently anti-racist, yet was very controversial at the time and still in some circles, with its use of vernacular language, vernacular being the actual accents and spellings of the characters being written about. It has been cited by some academics as being the first American novel to be completely vernacular throughout. And whilst writing it, Twain works in a study built away from the main house in Hartford so he could have peace and quiet, and he also continues to tour Europe and stayed for long stretches in Germany and here in London. In the late 1890s, from about 1896 to 98, he's meeting some very famous people and investing a lot in inventions and technology. He's making a fortune through the writing, but he lost in his lifetime an even bigger amount because of bad investments. His most popular invention was the page typesetting machine, and it would often print books such as Dracula, the author of which, Bram Stoker, lived at this location, number 18, and also lived next door at number 17. lived in this area and had another house around the corner. Mark Twain spent $300,000, that's the equivalent of 9 million in today's money, on this machine between 1880 and 1894. 14 years he invested this money, and it kept breaking down at exhibitions. And before it could even be perfected, it was rendered obsolete by the invention of the linotype. And he lost most of the book profits, as well as a pretty substantial portion of his wife's inheritance. He's also developing a close friendship with Nikola Tesla, the famous scientist, and through his influence, Mark Twain patented 3 inventions. First one was suspenders. The second one was a historical trivia game. And the third one, which I like the idea of this, is a self-pasting scrapbook system. He continues to write many other stories, books, articles, and mainly he's writing more quickly to pay back the money he had spent on the investments. And a whole other tour could be given about the fiasco that was his business sense. And I suppose, in a way, his mind was so great. He had opinions and knowledge about so many things. He was fascinated by science and technology and inventions. He just couldn't help but get involved in other fields of life. Another American, Benjamin Franklin, springs to mind. 1906, he begins working on his autobiography. Thomas Edison visits Mark Twain in his home in Redding, Connecticut. He meets Mahatma Gandhi. He's losing money. He's working on the memoirs that became his legacy. And then in 1910, Mark Twain passes away in Connecticut on April 21st. He was born when Halley's Comet made a pass in orbit, and he always said that he would go out with it as well. And he died just after, a few days after, the return of the comet, and his prediction came true. Very famous biography was written about Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. And he said, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it." And we're not too far from the house where he lived with his wife Olivia and his daughter Susie. We are in Chelsea. The nearest road just round to the left is Cheyne Walk. Cheyne, Cheyne, and it means oak-hearted. This is the Royal Hospital, commissioned by Charles II in 1681. And it was for the relief of war veterans. The rumour was that Charles II's mistress, famous mistress, an actress named Nell Gwynn, who worked a lot of Drury Lane, that her father passed away penniless, and she suggested that the Civil War victims and the war veterans should have a hospital dedicated, and she had his ear. Charles II, who a lot of this area was really built for, had 17 mistresses, and Nell Gwynn was his favourite. Now, the death of Mark Twain's daughter from meningitis had a really profound effect on him, and it left him sad and embittered. And this area, Chelsea, became a haven for the family. A reporter did ferret him out when he was in more or less seclusion here. in Tedworth Square, and he was cabled instructions from a newspaper, and the orders read, "If Mark Twain is very ill, send 500 words. If he is dead, send 1,000. And he knocks on the door. Mark Twain in this area opens the door and says, "You don't need as much as that. Just say the reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." So he's revered by many, has been one of the greatest authors, social critics, humorists that America has ever produced. I myself would call him a raconteur, a storyteller, the perfect balance between three factors: story, character, and themes. But with all that success came tragedy, as it did for so many writers who felt forced in their young ages to go into a profession and then, because of a death in the family, ended up clouding and colouring the work with those tragedies. His father, as I mentioned, succumbed to pneumonia when Twain was just 12 years of age, and it launched him into the workforce early. He lost his brother as well as 3 of his own 4 children before he passed away. But in spite of it, his mind and his wit still shone through in his work. Now, this film was made around Halloween, pre-Halloween, October of last year, because the light was so good. I thought, well, we can come out. So you may see some decorations. And just here, Oscar Wilde lived. Lady Wilde, his mother as well. But Oscar Wilde lived on this road, Tite Street, at number 34, with his wife Constance and their 2 sons. And it's where he penned the picture of Dorian Gray and An Ideal Husband. But ironically, the judge who sentenced the dramatist for gross indecency lived at number 58, about 10 doors up. Quite a few plaques in this area. It is one of the most expensive roads to live in the country. But we're walking down towards Tedworth Square, and where Mark Twain lived. He was a moralist. He wrote about regional areas. He wrote about rivers. The landscape, the rivers, were just as big as characters as the humans. He wrote about youth. He wrote about friendship. He explored parts of our identity, the American dream, racism, class barriers, like Charles Dickens, access to education and poverty, and so much more. And apart from almost every fictional story he wrote, I think my favourite book is his memoir, Life on the Mississippi, which was published in 1883. The great American novelist, one of the greatest ever, Ernest Hemingway, was quoted as saying that all modern American literature comes from one book by Mark Twain named Huckleberry Finn. He said American writing comes from that. There was nothing before, and there has been nothing as good since. So influential, not just to novelists, but to comedians today, telling their own observational tales in a witty, wry, sardonic way. To TV makers, to filmmakers. But when Livy and Mark's daughter, Susie, passed away in 1897, the two of them and their eldest daughter stayed in this area for a year, just over a year. And he said that apart from the speaking engagements that he had booked, he was almost completely reclusive. And a friend of his, Adele Chaplin, no relation to Charlie, was working as a volunteer at the Royal Hospital in Whitechapel and suggested that he went along to tell some stories and to try to build up the morale of the patients. And reluctantly, because he was being reclusive, he wanted peace and quiet apart from the working visits, the lectures. He didn't have to engage with many people except an audience. But he did go along to the Royal Hospital in Whitechapel, and there was a room full of the sick and the dying. And he told them stories, and he made them laugh. And he came back with tears in his eyes. This is what Ada said. And Mark Twain said, "I have never had such an appreciative audience." And this area in Chelsea, along the King's Road, just off the edge of the river, this inspired his work. This really was part of his life, his later years, and was home to so many other writers, academics, musicians. So the area of Chelsea is packed full of history. Bob Marley lived about 5 minutes walk from here on Oakley Street in 1977. Not for too long, but he fled to London in the late 70s after an attempt on his life in Jamaica. And while in London, he and his band, the Wailers, recorded Exodus. And he played football in Battersea Park. Again, 5 to 10 minutes walk from here. Captain Robert Scott, the Antarctic expeditionist, and 4 others tried to be the first to reach the South Pole, and Robert Scott was beaten by Roald Amundsen. He lived in this area. Mary Ann Evans, who was known by her pen name George Eliot, is within a stone's throw from here, an essayist, a journalist, a novelist, a poet, one of the leading writers of the Victorian era, and she felt she would get better published by using a pen name, George Eliot. As I mentioned, Bram Stoker. We also passed by very briefly the plaque of Philip Arnold Heseltine, known by his pseudonym Peter Warlock, a music critic, an occultist, and, well, the Warlock name, which reflected his occult practices, was used for all of his published musical works, and I do advise you to read about the life of Peter Warlock. Oscar Wilde's mother, Lady Wilde, lived here. She had a pen name. She was an Irish poet, and she used the pen name Speranza, and she was a supporter of the Irish nationalist movement. But here we're coming up to the home for just over a year of Mark and Livy and Clara. And I really hope you enjoyed this tour, because I did enjoy filming this, and we're doing this, of course, early in the morning, and I would like us all to just take for a moment the thought that sometimes people live in areas that they weren't born in and they don't die in, but those areas do eventually inspire their work. And when I talk about George Orwell, I walk along the Portobello Road. He didn't live there long, but the class differences are widely seen in Portobello and in Notting Hill to this very day. This area, maybe it's mainly rich people, but in the 1800s it was more of a mix. Now these roads are some of the most expensive, not just in the country, but in the entire world. And the house on the left here is where Mark Twain and Livy and Clara lived. Just off the King's Road, in the distance, is the River Thames, 215 miles long. And this is Chelsea. And this is Tedworth Square. And this was the sometime home of Mark Twain. In my research, I realised that Judy Garland got married just around the corner here in 1969, 3 months before she passed away. And we're remembering all of those wonderful people on this walk. Thank you so much